Welcome to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Perez, and we're so glad you're here. In our previous episode with Elizabeth Smart, she shared a personal story that vividly conveys the reason why we believe these kind of conversations are so critical. The story wasn't about her brutal captivity as a child, though. It was what happened to her as a young adult years later. Elizabeth shared a conversation she had with a young man while on a date. He was aware of her earlier captivity and the sexual violence she endured, and had the audacity to ask her, "Since you were raped so much, did you ever just lie back and try to enjoy it?" The sense of sexual entitlement and the normalization of the rape fantasy inherent in his question forces us to ask, how did we get here? What's going on in our culture that would lead a presumably otherwise normal young man to pose this question to his date? Well, our guest this episode is going to lead us deeper into these kinds of questions. Andrea Heinz is a friend and a partner in our work at Epic, and she brings a unique perspective to this conversation. She's a Canadian educator and activist who spent 7 years herself in Edmonton's licensed sex industry, exiting from that industry in December of 2012. Andrea is one of the most compelling voices advocating for the abolition of the sex trade in North America. She holds a diploma in correctional services and is presently completing a Bachelor of Professional Arts in Governance, Law, and Management. Andrea is a peer-reviewed scholar on the topic of commercial sexual exploitation, has written for several professional publications, participated in several interviews, and appeared as a witness for the Parliamentary Review of Canada's prostitution laws. In 2020, she was honored with a Woman of Courage Award by the Center to End All Sexual Exploitation in Edmonton. And recently, Andrea, along with co-author and indigenous leader Kathy King, published a book, When Men Buy Sex, Who Really Pays? Canadian Stories of Exploitation, Survival, and Advocacy. I'm proud to say that I had the privilege of contributing a small chapter to this expansive work, and I hope that you order a copy today, because profits from the sale of this book will be donated to projects supporting survivors and the prevention of sexual exploitation in Canada. In today's episode, we'll explore with Andrea not only how she entered and exited the commercial sex industry, but also how her journey took her from a participant in commercial sex, then as a brothel owner, to eventually becoming a vocal advocate for the abolition of the entire industry. In addition to philosophy, culture, and feminism, Andrea and I also discuss how to distinguish between commercial sex, prostitution, sex trafficking, and exploitation, a distinction that lays a foundation for all the episodes that will come after this one. As always, please remember that this is a conversation that touches on sexual violence, and while it's never our goal to sensationalize the trauma of this topic, we strive to speak truthfully about the damage being done. Thanks for joining us today as we explore more of the masculine wilderness.
Today's episode of the Masculine Wilderness Podcast is brought to you by Ride My Road, an anti-human trafficking organization with a focus on educating communities on the realities of human trafficking in the United States and raising funds for survivor-led organizations. To learn more, visit ridemyroad.org.
Well, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's so great to see you.
There should be like a little banner at the bottom. You look very much like a newscaster. That's great.
Future job I'm going for one day, right?
Yeah.
Play the part until you make it.
Well, thank you, Andrea Heinz, for just having this conversation with us today. The weird thing about this conversation for me is I feel like you and I are cousins in this work. Because we've connected multiple times over the years, but we have yet to actually meet in person. And it's just the weirdest thing, but I feel like, we've gotten to know each other, and you have had a huge impact on me, just on how I think about the work that we do at Epic. I know you've had a huge impact on our guys as well. You've been on multiple multiple calls and presentations with our volunteers and with our team. And I'm just really, one of the best things about the work I do is the people that I get to meet that I would have never crossed paths with. And you're you're at the top of that list. So I'm really grateful to be here. So I want to just give you a few minutes. I have some things I want to talk with you about, a couple of questions I want to ask you, but I want to just give you a little bit of time here to just tell us a little bit about yourself and about your journey into this space, because I think it's one of the most unique of all the people that I've interacted with in this space. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, where to start? I always feel like I'm a broken record because I feel like I tell the story so much. And I guess that's part of being experiential, is that your story kind of comes with your advocacy. It's a really grounding force in it. So I think, in present times, I think my situation and kind of my background that led me into the commercial sex industry is pretty common nowadays. We hear so many pathways in to sexual exploitation, right? Poverty, addiction, childhood sexual abuse, or just childhood neglect, all these types of things. And of course, those are still present today. But I think we're in a new era where we're starting to see a lot more of that social influence and of neoliberal ideology, which is, sex work ideology by extension.
Yeah.
And I think that that's starting to really infiltrate more of the middle class family and the young individuals that are coming out of those environments. So I think I was kind of in the early cusp of that in 2006 when I found myself 22 years old, $60,000 in debt, coming out of a bad string of abusive relationships for the 7 years prior to that. No real good education, no work skills, no financial literacy. It was kind of the perfect storm to lead me there. I think that, like I said, was kind of the turning point where we started seeing more mainstreaming of prostitution than what we saw historically, which was absolute destitution and, really rock bottom situations. So, my family is very loving. I never experienced any abuse in my home. My parents are still married, very supportive of me. And yet I still ended up in that industry largely on account of those two factors, debt and social conditioning. So at 22, here I have this $60,000 of credit card debt and all these other small debts. And I see this newspaper ad in the Edmonton Sun, and it said adult entertainment make $2,000 a week. And at 22, you'd think that you would know what that entailed, but I grew up in a small urban service area town, Fort McMurray, Alberta, and we didn't have a noticeable sex industry up there. So the only understanding I ever had of anything of that world was all through media, which, as we know, is very glamorized and recorded and romanticized. So, it was a very hard induction. It was a rough little while at the beginning there when I was new, because I was sought after by a lot of predators and people who were looking for the new girl. And I think we always go into that world saying, well, it's just a quick fix. I'm just going to do this for a couple months just to get out of the red and back in the black. And then you get captured. Once you're in there, it's so hard to get out. And that doesn't change on any of your other dynamics, really. We see women who, like I said, are coming from these good families who still end up in these situations and end up swallowed in that world.
Yeah.
That was 7 years of my life. And by the time then I was 29, I was able to finally exit the industry. And I've been doing activism ever since. And that's been a journey in itself that I could talk about, transition into that. But
Yeah. Well, and that's such a unique path into this. And that's one of the things that's always struck me. So that transition into activism, what were the things that triggered that for you? Like what was that scene? Because that's always fascinated me, that to go from being actively involved in the commercial sex industry to advocating for its eradication, I guess. I mean, so how did you make that transition? What was it that brought you there?
It was an awakening, is what I always say. It was the fog clearing. And the development, I think, of some self-worth in myself and realizing that I was going nowhere, even though I was making good money and I was at that point able to buy a car and I was able to put myself in university and put a down payment on a house, all these things that I really was doing before my time, probably.
Yeah.
We don't see people buying homes at 20, 25, any of those ages anymore. And that's sad, but it's the reality. So I think I was always chasing things a little bit too early for where I should have been. And then once you kind of stop and say, okay, here's where I am, but was it worth it? Was it worth all that I went through to get to where I am, where I probably eventually would have got to anyway, but I just was rushing that process of growing up or succeeding in life. And so I think once I could see the larger system of exploitation and understanding it in the context of violence against women, then I could really see the injustice that is inherent to commercial sexual exploitation. Yeah. And at that point, once you see the injustice, it ignites anger in you. And you have two choices. You either do something about it or you walk away with all this knowledge and really guilt then because you're not doing anything to change the status quo.
That's fascinating because the epiphany for me as a man in this work was similar in that, like, now that I know, like you have to choose. Either I walk away in willful ignorance or I roll up my sleeves and try to do something. That was exactly, gosh, it's been for me 15 years, I think, when I realized it personally as a man, not as a, never been a sex buyer or anything like that, but just as a guy. And I've watched, over the years with Epic, with our guys, like so many guys, that's a very common experience for people in this work. Once we know the reality, you face a choice. Do I walk away in willful ignorance or do I try to do something? I'm really glad I chose to try to do something. I'm glad you chose to try to do something. You also talked about recognizing systems and structures within that kind of ecosystem. What did you see? How did you recognize that there are, that this is a system? Like I talk a lot about, it's a business system driven by supply and demand. And you have a really astute perspective on this as a researcher and a writer, but like, what was the first indication that there were structures here that were not benefiting anybody but, well, I don't know who they're benefiting.
I think post-secondary education was the initial catalyst for me.
Okay.
Just learning about violence against women and taking courses that were focusing on socioeconomic marginalization and just issues that I had never really gone further than the surface on to really pull them apart, deeply and try to dissect them. So that was really kind of okay, maybe there's something else at play here. It isn't just a basic exchange for services. Like this is like you said, an ecosystem. There's many moving parts within this.
Yeah.
And so once I was kind of awakened slightly by the post-secondary readings, that was then where I started to, I think, have the fog clear, as I always say. It just started to thin a little bit. And then I could start to kind of pick up things that were happening in the current time and kind of looking and thinking, oh, that's sort of structural. That's not this like micro engagement here. This is a bigger thing. And this just happens to be the ripple effect.
Yeah.
So then you start becoming curious if you're a learner and a student and all those things. And so I started reading about just sexual exploitation abolitionist theory. And so, of course, I fell into things like Dworkin and McKinnon and all the classic stuff. But it was really the voices of survivors and experiential women that really piqued me. And that was when it was full blown. So I always say, Rebecca Mott, Annie Lobert, they were really the two that were quite active at that time with writing and filmmaking. And once I stumbled upon their work, then it was just no going back. It was a full awakening. And then everything was just very present.
You've written several things kind of about those systems and structures. The one that comes to mind, it's just profound to me, but the Mule for the Patriarchy, or A Mule for the Patriarchy. now that I get to talk to you directly about this, like I want to know what was the impetus behind that. Explain the gist of the article, and then I'm curious to know like what brought you to actually write that publicly, because it's a technical paper, but it reads more like almost like a journal entry, or it's much more intimate. But tell us about that particular piece. And
yeah, it's a bit more of a narrative piece.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. And that one kind of came about a little bit organically. I had published a paper called The Instep Model in September, I believe it was, of 2020. It was one of my COVID projects. And so that was published with Dr. Donna Hughes through Dignity Journal out of Rhode Island University. And I'm so grateful for her for publishing that work. And right around that time, I had actually made a tweet. I had just joined Twitter, and I can't remember the exact wording of the tweet, but it basically said, to all the women that I ever said sex work is work, I'm sorry for that cultural impact. To all the women who were wives and girlfriends of the sex buyers that I took, money from and home funds from, I'm sorry. Again, I can't remember all of it, but was for whatever reason, this tweet specifically went quite viral. It got thousands of likes, and people were kind of, I guess, probably a little bit skeptical of me having at one point owned a small boutique brothel myself that I was selling sex out of.
Yeah.
They're like, who is this owner that all of a sudden is doing a complete 180? Like, should we trust her, or is this like a planted mole, or,
right.
Uncertainty. So Dr. Hughes, right when I was publishing that paper, she also saw that tweet, and she said, I would really love for you to write another paper that expands on this awakening that you went through and how you realize that prostitution is harmful for other women, how it isn't this hyper individualized transaction between just buyer and seller.
Right.
And so I said, oh, that'd be great. I'd love to do that. I've actually been giving this a lot of thought lately, and I've wanted to write about that. And that was, oddly enough, one of the easiest papers I ever wrote. It was like it flowed out so organically. I sat down to do it, and there was no hindrance. It just came out so beautifully. The paper really talks about how, when I entered, again, I just didn't see things in collective sense. I saw it as, okay, it's me and it's the sex buyer. There's nobody else involved. Nobody else is impacted. And the paper then starts pulling apart the moments where I could see where men were really disrespecting women and using women, and how I was caught up in that system, yet thinking that I was in some type of higher role, or that I could be immune from the misogyny and the patriarchal influences. So the paper talks about, women showing up to the brothel, showing photos of men that were fathers that they had children with, and saying, have you seen this man? He's been, paying for sex, I'm certain, because we have hundreds of dollars going missing from our account. Other men who would come and basically say that they weren't cheating on their wives because it was sex work is work. And that I was, then in those moments I could recognize I was being reduced to a body. I was not even a woman who was worthy of being considered someone that he had cheated with. I was just a masturbatory aid that he had used to cheat.
Yeah. Wow.
So just things after that, like a guy coming in, talking about being married, and like only had gotten married, I think a week or two maybe prior to that. And
wow.
It just, all these little moments. So the paper, I think, is really neat because it also says that there's stages of this awareness and this awakening. And some women are just on this autopilot path, understandably, because of trauma, and they can't see that. And then there's other women that do see it, but they don't link their involvement to it. And then there's women who are very aware that by selling sex, that they are impacting other women and wives and girlfriends and children and communities, but they either care or they don't care.
Yeah.
So it kind of gets into saying, like, what is the mindset of women in this collective sense, and how can we move together to safeguard one another from being, picked apart and taken off to slaughter, essentially, by people who are there to hurt us.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I've read a ton over the years, just research and, different people from different places, different lanes in this work. And that just, the insight that you bring is that I feel like a broken record is I think it's really unique. I want to dive into the whole sex work thing. This is, I think, professionally where you and I, where our work in this area have intersected. There is a growing wave, it feels like, of, and it's an ideological thing. In certain circles, it's an ideological thing, wants to separate sex work from prostitution. And by default, if I think I'm understanding it correctly, I should by now, but it also then, by doing that, it separates sex work from trafficking and from sexual exploitation. Like they want to paint the scenario that those are different things and we should treat them differently. So I know as a man, like if I put myself in the, kind of in the headspace of, buyers I've interacted with either, through our patrols online or even in the John schools that we've been a part of, like I can understand how, your average guy is like, well, yeah, let's keep them separate because one is really, appealing and attractive. And if it, sure, if she's willing and it's the whole two consenting adults. So I understand the draw. And it does feel like it draws men like, yeah, if that were the case, that would be really good. And it also aligns with some of the best research I've read on just sex buyers in general, that there's a significant number of men, and this was specific to America, but there's a considerable number of men who aren't buying sex now, but if the conditions were right, they would enter that market. So I feel like we're trying to keep back a flood of new, sex buyers. But anyway, my question to you is like, where does this come from and what is it? What is this all about? And you've spoken extensively about this. And again, you have a really unique perspective on it. How do you break down the sex work is work versus trafficking versus prostitution? Like, how do you explain that to people in a way that brings clarity?
Oh, well, I think clarity is the key word, because that assumption that we have these neat, perfectly packaged compartmentalizations operates on the assumption of clarity, authenticity, all of these things that really don't typically exist once you're getting into coercive sexual activity. So how does a buyer, and this is always my question for people, how does a buyer differentiate between a trafficked woman and a so-called fully autonomous happy hooker, sex worker, as they would call them?
Can't you just ask them?
Yeah, exactly. Right. That's the answer. That's the sad part, is that's the answer all the time. You just ask them. And I shake my head and I think, do people not understand, marketing and all these things? Like, at the end of the day, prostitution is still a business. It's a multi-billion-dollar business every year, tons of money to be made. Sex sells. We know that. So, we have to look at it and say, okay, there's money behind this and there's marketing behind it. And I've said this in every interview I think I've ever done, because I always want to reiterate that I think the average man is a really good human at their core. I believe that men are honest and caring and that they have potential. And I know, maybe some very jaded people might disagree with me on that. They'll say they're all bad, they would do it and get away with it, like you said.
Yeah. I hear you say that like you're a bad feminist.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, exactly. And I don't want to say the feminists will get mad at me, because right. I believe that if you are a genuine feminist, you're not a misandrist. I think, misandrists, they exist because they have been traumatized, or they have just bore witness to extensive trauma and exploitation that they become rightfully jaded. But I think when you kind of step out of this dark area, you do see that most men are pliable to change. They're well-intentioned. And like women who sell sex, a lot of men who buy sex become captured in these money-making and marketing schemes. And so it's seen as this, you deserve it. Oh, all the marketing for these brothels. You deserve to relax. You deserve to be treated like the king that you are. All this stuff that really feeds on, I think, men's brokenness, because we know that men and women in many regards are not doing well right now in our self-worth, in our our character, in, the things that we're striving to achieve. Sex work ideology is like a parasite that takes hold of anyone and everything that comes within its path. And I've seen really nice men that came into the brothel that I don't think that they were predators. I don't think that they were bad people. They were just captured by that whole, come here, let us, unwind you after a long week of working hard. Are you feeling unappreciated in your life? Like, well, we all feel unappreciated.
Yeah.
So it keeps on going back to that, where I tell people, like, you're being duped. You have to look at who is telling you this and why they're telling you this. And the truth is oftentimes not warm and fuzzy, and especially not in this area. So once you start actually talking about the truth, and like we said, going back to those ecosystems and kind of breaking it down and analyzing it, I think a lot of people do have the potential to realize that whether you're a buyer or a seller, the industry is not conducive to where you genuinely want to end up in life and what you genuinely value. Because a lot of these men are going there looking for love and looking for affection and all these things, but those are purchased. They are feigned. They are not authentic. You're not actually getting what you're missing. You're getting a Band-Aid solution, and now you're out several $100s after you've subjected yourself to that mockery, really, that lie from an external source telling you, oh, here you go. This is what you're missing. This is what you need. Thanks for the money. And same thing with the women. You want to be empowered. You want to have this, you want to have that. Here you go. We have a way to give it to you, but we're not going to tell you that it's also going to bleed your soul out and that you're going to feel like you've given away so much of yourself, a piece of yourself to all these people. And at the end, you're actually going to be more, destitute probably, because now you have trauma that you have to work through, and you have depression and all these things that you incurred by buying into that lie of sex work as this all-encompassing, beautiful thing that will fix your issues or your ails.
How do you respond to the notion that sex work is empowering? And explain it for men. I'm really curious to hear a woman explain why that statement is full of contradictions.
I think it is really hard to have people understand a lot of things that are complex until they've journeyed through it or have observed it for a very long time in many circumstances and dynamics. So when people see something like the media depictions that romanticize things, that's their only understanding of it. Or if they see something where it's only trafficking, and they never understand that there are some people that do genuinely feel empowered. My opinion is that they're not genuinely empowered, but they feel that way. When you see those two depictions only, you have a very narrow lens of the entire ecosystem again, like we said. So I say this at the John School, and I find that it's quite impactful whenever I lecture there. I say, imagine yourself, sir, who is sitting here. I want you to think about the man that you work with at your job who is incredibly unattractive to you. You find him unhygienic, crass, aggressive, annoying, whatever it may be that really turns you off of this person. You don't like working with them. You don't like doing any of those things. Now imagine that you have no money to buy your food. And now imagine that you're going to sit in this room and you're going to wait for somebody to ring the doorbell. You don't know who it's going to be. They're going to show up, and suddenly it's that man that you work with. He tries to refuse a shower. He tries to get a deal from you and cheapen you. He's pushy with your boundaries. He's 2 inches away from your face, breathing his rancid breath up your nostrils. He's grinding his body against you. He's saying, oh yeah, you like that, don't you? He's dominating you, and he's going inside your body. How would you feel? And I've never met one man that wasn't like, that sounds absolutely horrific. But that's such a big part of it, is empathy, is about being in the other person's position. And so stopping and thinking, okay, I like sex. I like having sex with random women. I like having sex on demand as soon as I want it because I have money. Those things, sure, of course you're going to like that. But now switch roles.
Yeah.
Inject yourself into her world for a moment and think, do I want to have sex for money to sustain my livelihood? Do I want to have sex with Joe from my shift who, his work gear smells terrible and he's rude and aggressive? Do you want those things? And what always kind of disheartens me and frustrates me is that sometimes there are men that will say, yeah, well, we all do jobs that we don't want to do. So even when they can empathize and they can get into that position, there's still that desire to justify it. But I think that that's because they're so deeply rooted in their own lens still, that they can't truly let that go and put that down for a moment to genuinely switch places with the person and say, what does that actually feel like? But I think, when people aren't sex buyers and when they aren't so deep into that, they do have the ability to switch over and empathize. And that's really where
a friend of mine years ago, he was a writer and he's written broadly on the subject of justice and in various settings. But he talked about in several places about empathy. I love that you brought that up. Empathy is like foundational to justice, because if we can't put ourselves in their place, it's never going to change. One of the most haunting things. So we've been doing these patrols, which I know you know about for years. We've been directly talking to sex buyers at the point of sale, and I was observing one of our teams. And he was, just diligently trying to draw this guy out into conversation and trying to say, look, basically trying to say, let's practice some empathy here. And this buyer just interrupted, and he just literally says, whatever, dude, I just want to get laid. And it was such a it wasn't necessarily like a violent comment, but it was so utterly lacking in empathy, to say whatever. And that basically, and by doing that, you're saying that the person you're trying to purchase is a whatever, like what you talked about earlier, like not a person, not a human being. In your mind, is it oversimplifying things to say we have this struggle in our culture because we are really deficient in empathy? Or is that fair?
I think that's fair to a certain degree. And I think technology has played such a huge part in that. Like it has this really dual nature where it connects us more than ever, but it also divides us more than ever. Like, you and I probably wouldn't have met without technology, and here we are, countries connecting. But at the same time, like people are just so in their own world, and we're not seeing community involvement. We're not seeing even the same degree of family involvement. A lot of people are like, I just never see my adult children. They never make time for me. And we've become this world where, I don't know, everybody is just so engulfed in their own lives, which of course we have to be. We live in capitalism. We have to pursue money to survive and do all the things that we have to do. But all of our extra time, it seems, is not being put back into community. And, I know you're probably like me. We do a lot of unpaid activism and a lot of unpaid work and just conversations and sharing circles and meetings where ideas are exchanged. And, we don't get compensated for that, but there's so much richness in that. And I feel like that's what compensates me more than anything I could be doing that would be of a money basis.
Yeah.
So I think it just keeps coming back down to being heart-centered, being collectively focused, like collective consciousness, and really unplugging a little bit and getting out of our own world and trying to be more involved in the lives of other people.
Yeah, that's such a painful admission, like to say, yeah, we're more connected than ever because of technology, and in so many ways more isolated from one another because of technology. I can recall, I won't blame my daughters because they're a little bit too old for this to have been a thing, but I have seen groups of kids, even, like young adults, sitting together, sharing the same physical space, and every one of them, on a phone, talking to someone who's not there. And it's just like, it's such a, and I've done that. My wife and I've done that, we're sitting together in the morning over coffee. And when we used to spend that time talking, in my case, I'm doom scrolling, and
she probably is too, right?
No, she's way more constructive than me. She's catching up with friends on Facebook, and at her worst, she's on Amazon, but that's at her worst. But me, I'm looking for all the bad news. But anyway, we're right there in the same space. So, and it's interesting. This is not an American phenomenon, is it? You've seen it in Canada.
Oh, big time. Same thing. Like you go to any mall, like now with Christmas shopping, been to a mall a couple times, you go into the food court. That's exactly what it is. People just sitting there, like 5-6 people at a table, just texting. And I'm like, I wonder if they're actually like liking each other's posts, and so the same people at the table. But yeah. And I don't know. I think it's just made people lose this sensitivity chip and this like actual connection. Because when you talk to someone, I don't know if this is universal, but whenever I talk to people, I actually feel like something that goes doop, like this connection, this human interaction. And I don't know if other people just don't get that now, if they just don't experience that depth with others.
Yeah, I don't know if I don't know if people in general get it, but I think we all, in our quiet moments, however few and far between they are, I think we feel the loss of that. Like I know from talking directly with buyers over the years, I know from stories that our guys have shared with us, like there's just so much disconnection, isolation, all the things you said that lead men to think, well, buying sex is the thing that's going to fill that void. Like, and it doesn't, but it's always there with our guys. Can you, I want to go back to the sex work, trafficking, prostitution, the sex work and trafficking. Can you kind of break down how the sex work perspective tries to differentiate? What are they, how do they parse that out? And how can we respond to it?
Yeah, I think it's very much like what you said. It's not too complex. It's just compartmentalization. That is really the true nature of it. Every argument where they try to separate it is about compartmentalization. This is one thing. This is another thing. There's no crossover. There's no similarities. But if you look at, some of the work of people that have written about this, like Gerasi and Nichols, I believe in 2017 said that, agency and victimization operate on more of a continuum than they do in these neatly segregated areas. So, you might start out in the industry as a so-called sex worker. You have nobody controlling you in any kind of way. But now you, for example, start incurring some trauma. You start getting maybe into debt because you're trying to soothe that trauma by buying materialistic things. And now all of a sudden a pimp comes along, a trafficker, sees that you're kind of in this rough place. And then all of a sudden now you're under their control. Or people conversely sometimes end up where they start out trafficked and deceived and duped. And then it comes into this narrative because of sex work ideology of empowerment and reclaiming your autonomy and all this, so that when they finally break away from a trafficker, sometimes maybe they don't know what else to do or they don't have the confidence to do it. But other times it'll be, now I'm going to take back my power. Now I'm going to reclaim this and I will do this for myself and I will choose to do it this time, kind of foregoing and forgetting all of what led them to that so-called decision that they made or that choice. So I think that there's a lot of fluidity, a lot of gray in this area. And that, again, goes back to the buyers not being able to tell, okay, this woman who is maybe 25, okay, mature in her age now and, should know kind of what's going on, right and wrong, blah, blah, blah. She tells me that she chooses it, that she likes it, that she would never do anything else. But that man doesn't know her history. He doesn't know if she was, sexually trafficked prior to that. He doesn't know if she was abused as a child. He doesn't know anything. He just sees that presentation of her, which goes back again to that marketing. So I think a lot of people that say sex work is work maybe have been fortunate enough that they have only ever been in that area of that space of prostitution where they haven't experienced trafficking, or maybe they haven't known people who have experienced that. So they cannot understand that fluidity because they haven't bore witness to it. And so to them, it's like, well, you're just saying something that is not true to my reality and everything. And I think that that's where I am fortunate in that now that I'm an abolitionist, I wasn't always an abolitionist. I was a liberal feminist through and through when I was in prostitution. I was very full decrim supporter.
And you thought just like you described, that was your thinking, right? I mean,
exactly, because I had never been trafficked, right? And so once I ended up in the industry, all I saw around me was the presentation of sex workers.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I exited, and then a lot of the women that I did sell sex alongside during my active time, they reached out to me and said, "Oh my gosh, I see, some of your activism, or I've read your papers. Like, thanks for speaking out. I actually exited and this was my backstory." And I'm like, oh my gosh, like mind blown, because that's not the woman I knew when I was in prostitution. You were the quote unquote happy hooker. Like, I always thought you liked this job and chose this job. And they'd say no, but how could I ever say anything different to the women who were so swallowed up by that, or to the men who I had to lie to appease their egos and get their money?
Right. Wow.
Yeah. We just never know what's under the surface.
Yeah. And as long as those things don't get called into question, and as long as we don't think a little bit longer and more deeply about it, the system perpetuates. Money's being made. And even though there are some women that might have the agency, to choose it, it inflames a market, so to speak, that also puts like more vulnerable people at risk for being caught up in it as well. Your work has overlapped and intersected, I think, in multiple places with the murdered and missing Indigenous women movement. And it's the problem, the issue is, I know, is huge in Canada. It's not unique to Canada, but can you talk a little bit about that? So you're going from, what I'm thinking here is, we have and just use you as kind of the example of that. You have this woman who has, a reasonable amount of agency and, kind of self-determination to say, I'm going to go do this. And you have, Indigenous women from Indigenous communities that are vulnerable for a whole bunch of different reasons. They all get drawn into this market. Talk to me a little bit about the work that you're doing there, and what do you see in Canada, or even more broadly, about how Indigenous women and people in general are threatened by this industry.
Yeah, it's exactly like you said. It's not exclusive to Canada, but I think Canada has really, surprisingly, done a very good job in highlighting this issue and really bringing it to the forefront. And I really credit that to a lot of strong, powerful Indigenous leaders, particularly women, who are bringing this forward and saying, let's talk about this, because we just don't talk about it in larger society, because I think of hierarchies and privilege and stuff like that. Like, when you're on the top, what's the saying? When you're on the top, you look down and all you see is shitheads. And when you're on the bottom and you look up, all you see is, pardon my language, assholes. It's like birds on the different things, right? So the people who are really being oppressed, they're looking up and saying, nobody cares about us. They're just shitting on us, and they don't care. And then the people who are in these higher status positions within society are looking down and saying, well, they just can't get their lives together and get organized and fix their own problems. And so again, it's this disparity really that we're left with. And so I'm very, very honored that I get to even be a part of that conversation. I'm not Indigenous. I don't have any Indigenous in my blood, but I really feel welcomed by a lot of people in the Edmonton Indigenous community who are fighting on this issue, because I think they recognize that we need to all come together, regardless of race, regardless of sex, any of those things, and really tackle what is a huge pressing issue in Canada and elsewhere. Like, we don't know the numbers, we never will concretely, but we have about 4,000 missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Wow. And they say that about 50% of those who are being sex trafficked in Canada are Indigenous women and girls. So that's alarming. Indigenous people don't even comprise 5% of our population. They are one of our fastest growing populations within Canada, though. Yeah. And so that's where we have to act now. We have to do something about it now, because we are going to see a large boom in the Indigenous population. And we're not going to be prepared for the exploitation that continues to happen to their group. Yeah.
So connect the dots again for me, just because I think this is really important. So the Indigenous population in Canada is a fraction of the larger population. So are you saying they're disproportionately represented in the trafficking victim population, as far as we can tell, right?
Yes. So yeah, under 5% of total population, but 50% of our sex trafficking victims.
Okay. And then so when you hear of a murdered and missing indigenous person, again, I know that there's and this is one of the problems with this whole issue is there's so little data, but it's not unreasonable to assume that when you hear of a murdered or missing indigenous person, that they might also have been trafficked, right? I mean, can you make that connection reasonably or?
Yeah, I'm hesitant to make it outright because I think that, I wouldn't want to say to any surviving family members that their missing and murdered indigenous loved one is someone who was in the sex industry. So
that's a good point.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it outright, but I do know that there's also a lot of shame within that community to discuss these issues. And I've had indigenous leaders say to me, this is an issue. And so many of us know that it's an issue in our community, but because of the shame and the stigma placed upon the women, which we see, with non-indigenous women as well, right? It's always the elder's problem. We're always talking about what she did wrong, how she got herself there, how it was an individual issue rather than a structural issue.
Right. She's a prostitute. It's not that she was prostituted.
Exactly. Yeah. It wasn't that something led her there. It was that she chose to go there kind of thing. So they say that's why a lot of the family members just don't even want to identify that their loved one was in any way exploited, because then it just adds that extra layer of victim blaming that to deal with. So, but if you were asking me directly, do I believe that that's usually the case? Whereas when someone is marginalized as a female, that they are more likely to have been caught up in sexual exploitation as a means of survival, or just someone putting that power on them, I would say absolutely yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And we see
a faulty tie. I would say you're right, but it's
yeah. So you can't automatically make that connection. And I appreciate that. I think that's a helpful distinction there, because even to insinuate that that's also something that happened to your missing loved one, it just is adding horrific insult to the injury already. But yeah, I mean, we know from like in the US, and I think this is true elsewhere, that Black and brown indigenous women, marginalized women, face an exponentially higher risk of getting caught up in this. Are there people that in the indigenous movement that have are there leaders that you would want to give a shout out to and say these are people whose voices we should listen to?
Yeah, absolutely. There's too many to name, but I think probably the top three, I would say, or if I had to choose three, one would be Dr. Diane Redsky. She is out of Winnipeg, and she's a nonprofit founder. And I believe she was also the director of the National Task Force on Human Trafficking Against Women and Girls. I don't have her exact title in front of me, but brilliant woman who has really paved the way in Canada for these conversations and tying it to sexual exploitation. And she's actually someone that sort of challenges me still to this day and said, I noticed that you use the word sex trade. Is it really a trade? Is a trade kind of implies equal give and take? Like, is it not maybe just an industry? Should we maybe shy away from using the word sex trade? And so little things like that where I'm like, wow, I never thought of that. It's more of a taking. It's a taking of something.
It's an extractive industry, is like mining almost.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So she just has these really powerful ways. I've been fortunate to be on panels with her and have private conversations with her. And she just has these brilliant ways of kind of further pulling apart something that some days I feel like I know quite well. And then someone will say something and you're, oh, wow, I never even went down that rabbit hole with it. So she's one influential Indigenous leader in my mind. The second one is a very, very close, dear friend of mine, and I've mentioned her before, April Eve Weiberg. She's the founder of Stolen Sisters and Brothers Action Movement. And she has just really been a grassroots leader, a powerhouse leader. And she's herself a survivor of trafficking throughout organized crime syndicates in your country, down in the States, where she was kind of taken and moved around the circuits along those areas. And then, also had some time where she was so-called independent and autonomous. Right. So again, that's kind of talking about those overlaps. And her voice is so powerful. She just does amazing keynote presentations, and she leads with love, which always astounds me so much. And she really brings me back to saying, okay, lead with love. Don't come from anger. Don't come from any kind of resentment or anything like that. Lead with love, and that will take you to the truth and to the happy ending. And so to speak, that was a bad pun, or it wasn't even intentional. That just came out. But yeah, I did not mean to say happy ending, but
went right over my head.
Yeah. And then the third one I would say, and I don't know if she actually is Indigenous. I mean, I've been meaning to ask her, but I know she does incredible work with the Indigenous community, and I believe has some Indigenous relatives, is Trisha Baptiste. And she is out of Vancouver, and she is really somebody who here in Canada has pushed very hard for equality model legislation that we have, which is PSEPA, the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. That's our Nordic model legislation. Very instrumental in the conversations with members of parliament and committees and all the people at the table who are pushing these policies forward. Trisha's been on international committees discussing Indigenous exploitation and the rights of Indigenous peoples. So yeah, I would say those three people, Dr. Diane Redsky, April Eve Weiberg, and Trisha Baptiste, are really phenomenal women in Canada, really pushing forth the change.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That part of this story or this conversation about exploitation and trafficking and the way it intersects with that particular community, and the same could be said with the Black and brown communities of women. It's just the tension between the marginalization and what those people experience, and that just utter callousness, getting back to what we talked about earlier, the guy that just wanted to get laid and he just didn't care. Like those two things just create for me a tension. Like, what has happened that this is the world of men, that you can exist in that, and with that kind of attitude, with that utter lack of empathy. And you mentioned lead with love, like what your friend talked about. You've absorbed that because you do the same thing. You do the same thing. And it's surprising and counterintuitive because you've also seen what men are capable of, and I've always found that just humbling and shocking and like really life-giving, like just to hear it coming from a woman. But I know I've asked you in the past, trying to remember why. I think we were on a call. Don't even remember what it was about necessarily, but I asked you what gives you hope. I think it was a moment where I was feeling, pretty hopeless, just thinking about all these big, weighty, difficult things. And you said, as part of the reason I remember it, I said, what gives you hope? And you said, well, not old guys in their 60s or something to that effect, not old guys, but young men. And I'm looking at you going, what? Wait, not me? And you said, I think you said present company excluded or something, but I want to return to that. I just want to ask you again, like you see hope, at least a little bit in young men in the culture. Can you say more about that? Like, what do you see? Or if that's changed since we last talked about it, like, but where do you see hope?
That's funny. I don't even honestly remember that conversation. So it must have just been the vibe of that day. I must have had some kind of good interaction with a young man that day.
I remember it because I'm like, oh, crap, I guess I'm out.
You're definitely an inspiration to me all the time. But, it's interesting because some days it changes. It really changes based on the dynamic of the ecosystem that we keep talking about. And there's something happening in Gen Z, and it's really unique, I think, because we haven't seen it with the boomers. We haven't seen it with the millennials. But with Gen Z, I think it's maybe, and this is bad to say, but it's kind of like we live in this like victim society, like the oppression Olympics to many degrees, where a lot of people, okay, well, I have this and I have this going on and mine's worse than yours and I'm more oppressed than you. And I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't dissect and examine systems of oppression. I obviously agree we should, but I think it's kind of, I don't know if it's something to do with technology, but we've gotten to this point where people are just, I think they're lacking a lot of character because they're not out there developing their character because they're at home gaming or they're, doom scrolling and doing all the kind of stuff like that. So I think that there's this small pocket within Gen Z that is really starting to come around to being radicalized and kind of waking up to this. And I see a lot of younger men, actually quite young, that are saying like, nah, I would never pay for sex. I would never do that to a woman. I would never use my money to coerce a yes out of her, a feigned yes out of her, like never. Whereas, I don't know, I wonder if as we get older, our light kind of dims down and we just sort of resign ourselves to, well, this is the way that the world is. So I might as well get mine, right? And forget about trying to make change.
I know that feeling of just resignation. Like, just throw your hands up. Let's go drink beer and watch football. I totally get that. You're so consistent in your language, and you use radical. And I think it's one of the things I picked up from you. I don't think you taught it to me directly, but from your writing and our conversations, that word, it's either like a dog whistle for certain people, or it's a panic button, especially people coming from a more conservative background, to hear someone talk about a radical. But, and tell me if I'm wrong on this, but when you use the term radical by definition, I believe this is true historically. A radical was someone who looked at the systems and the structures and saw the damage being done by them and wanted to challenge the systems and structures. Is that what a radical is? And when you use that term?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm using it more so in, I guess, a feminist concept, because radical feminism, when we hear the term radical, we think of extremist. Right. And that's the problem, is that people are like, oh, they're radicals. They're, but it's exactly what you said. Radical actually means at the root. So it means getting down to the real nitty gritty of it. Like, what is the basis of this? What is the foundational consideration to it? But people, of course, have just, vilified that, because that's where change happens, is when you get back down to the root and change things. So then it's become synonymous with extremist.
So we misunderstood that term. So radical is at the root. Then what's the connection? What is radical feminism?
It just means feminism at the root, basically. Okay. So you have your different strains of feminism, like you've got socialist feminism, you've got radical feminism, you've got liberal feminism, you've got Marxist feminism.
All
so
kinds,
different ones, But radical feminists are the ones that really are, to some people, the most, and this is the wrong word to use, but the most aggressive, because they are the ones that are really going for, the crux of the issue there. They're the ones that are getting right to the nitty gritty. And that's where people don't like to venture into the conversation. So they're like, oh, radical women, radical extremist women. And it's not, in my mind, any kind of bad term. And I'm grateful every day that I was radicalized, and I try to use the word in the right sense so that it becomes more of a mainstream word again and isn't synonymous with extremism.
Right. I think that's really helpful. And words matter. Like we all know that, especially in this work, the language we use to describe the issues, it can change the trajectory of everything we do. There is a gal from Calgary, by the way. I don't know if I've ever talked to you about it. She is an author, and she comes from a Christian background, but she wrote a book called Jesus Feminist. And so she looks at the kind of the Christian tradition and makes a really compelling case about how it's actually in the sense that we're talking about, it is a feminist thing. But I love her definition. She says a feminist is simply someone who's committed to the radical idea that women are people too. Mm-hmm. And I just love the simplicity of that. I had a friend give me, I think I may have even sent you a picture of this, but the vest I ride motorcycles with, my nickname is just a patch right here that says feminist.
Yeah.
I love that. So the whole idea, and I think this is what makes, I think for men, our work a little bit uncomfortable, is that we are proposing radical solutions, not necessarily destructive solutions, but they're radical because they're trying to get to the root of the problem. And I know that's your heart too, because you focus on the structures and the culture and all of that. So but back to my question. So you're saying you're finding hope in people in the Gen Z community who are willing to, are you saying they're willing to stand up and be radical?
Some, like, I wouldn't say it's all of them, but I would say like the small uprising that I'm seeing both in males and females in Gen Z. So it's not just men, but it's really, I think what happens is that when you have something like this, which is the pendulum swing, which we see happen all the time here in this topic, we start to go very, very lax, and then we realize, oh my gosh, this is very problematic. There's all this community. Now we tighten up and we go in the so-called Puritan direction, and then people get tired of that. And so we're on this ever swinging pendulum, it feels like. And I feel like we have gone so far, we have inverted ourselves so far on this sexual liberation that was happening, in the 70s around there, that now people are starting to see the hypersexualization that is so rampant in society, and to a really grotesque degree now. Like now we've got, young kids at ages of 7, 8, 9 viewing pornography. That never happened before. We can't watch a music video for the most part of almost any female artist, some exceptions, that isn't, and this is sad, but someone said it's a stripper with a mic. Is what they're saying of every female performer now, because it's not even really about your talents. It's about your sexualization. All the marketing, again, it has infiltrated everything, absolutely everything. It's infiltrated academia. You can't even put forth any kind of radical judgment or assessment of prostitution without being vilified in academia, looked at as some Puritan again. And so I think we've gone just so far to this side that people are starting to tire of it. And they're just like, man, it's just in your face all the time. And they're seeing the ripple effect of the damage to others and community, that now we're starting to go in the other direction. So it all takes time. But I think Gen Z I think they're seeing it. Whereas other people, like we've said, have just kind of resigned themselves to being like, it's too big of a fight.
I agree. We have a campaign going now that My Friends Are Not for Sale, which is a student, basically student prevention focused campaign. And we just a couple weeks ago, we did at a middle school, at a junior high, we had a sequence of events. First would be a girls only lunchtime thing where we invite all the kids in this school, it's a fairly large school, all the girls to come and have a conversation with some of our leaders. And then the next week was a boys only lunch meeting. And then that night, a parents meeting. And we broadcasted, invited everyone in the community and the school district and all of that. And so for the girls meeting, we had 50 girls show up because they're concerned about it. They see it. Some of them, may be in the process of being groomed. And then a week later, we had the boys thing, and 70 boys showed up. They see it. And I suspect I didn't get a chance to talk to really any of them, but just the fact that they would show up on their lunch hour of their own free will, it's like, this is important. So 50 girls, 70 boys that night. Then we had the parent night. You know how many parents showed up?
I'm going to say 30, if that. No?
0.
Wow. And you think it would be the other way, where that would be the largest?
You would think, but it's kind of to your point about how these younger generations, it feels like in some ways the kids are leading us. They're seeing things that we're, I think, a lot of times unable to or unwilling to see. But we were really kind of riding high, really encouraged that we got that kind of student response. And then now let's go talk to the parents. And there were a handful of people in the room that were either teachers or parents of the students that were actually giving the presentations, and it was really, really discouraging. But I think it does kind of support your point. So we're in the process at Epic of developing more resources and energy to focus on, ways that we can engage those people. So I love that. I love that. Just finally being able to work with younger people again. It's been really cool.
I just want to add one quick thing to that. So people always say, work with youth, focus on youth. They are the change. And I wholeheartedly agree. But I also sometimes lately, I found myself challenging that and that are saying that and saying, don't forget that youth are born into a world where they are influenced by the older generation. Yeah. And I don't think that anybody is ever completely rigid where they cannot be open to. Yeah. I've seen, some sex buyers come through our John school that were in their 70s, and that was their first moment of actual awakening. And they're like, oh my gosh, I get it. And so I actually tell people it's just as important for us to work with the older generations as it is with the younger ones, because the older ones are still going to be having that influence and they're still going to be setting that example for these younger ones.
Yeah.
So it's very hard for youth to challenge their peers, right? It's very easy to kind of be like, that old person doesn't know what they're talking about, on the new generation, but they have a harder time challenging their peers. So I always say to people, it is important that we tackle, the youth and the messaging that they're receiving, but we have to remember where that messaging is coming from. Who are these CEOs? Who are these marketers? Who are these people that are in these positions creating this content that is being sold to these youth? So we got to reach everybody, really.
Yeah. And thank you for calling out that tension. You're right. You're absolutely right. One of the afflictions I endure in my old age is cynicism. So you are right. And we're not abandoning the work that we're doing with grown men at all. But I think I think you're right. I think it's important to call that out because men can change. And to your other point, like men have power and influence that is unique and can be, I would argue, must be leveraged to change the world that our boys are growing up into. You mentioned, porn exposure at 8 years old. My grandson just turned 8. And when you said that, I'm like, I just had this knot in my stomach, is realizing like that this is my grandson. This is the world that he's growing up into. So I don't want to, I have no plans on giving up. And I'm, it's also one of the fun things about the work I do is I'm old enough now, like, I don't care if what I'm doing pisses you off or the things I'm talking about make you uncomfortable. I don't care.
You've earned the right to have your voice.
And I don't, this is not for professional. I don't have any professional ambition, but I'm a grown ass man in this world, and I still have something to say, and I intend to say it. And I know I'm not alone. I know there's a lot of really good men that you and I both know. So I want to do just two more questions with you. We talk at Epic about this thing. We use the term generative masculinity. And I know you love words, so I'm going to geek out here just a little bit, but toxic masculinity, the word toxic, toxins by definition break down the bonds that form healthy life. Generative is the antithesis of that. It's things that create and sustain life and thriving. And so we talk about learning how to show up in our world as men in a way that's life-giving instead of life-taking. And so it's, in some way, it's the simplest way to describe it is like, how do we become men that show up in all the different ways men show up in this world with the mindset of what can I give versus what can I get? So, but in order to become that kind of man, you have to pay attention to the whole person, and you have to, like you eloquently said earlier, like there's a story behind these people that are, entering into this sex buying transaction, both the buyer and the seller. So there's more to our world. Anyway, we talk a lot about cultivating and doing things that are generative and life-giving, just as a way to be a healthier person in the world. So I think I know the answer to this question for you because we've talked at length, but what's life-giving for you? What are the things that for you just make you, able to just take a deep breath and go, all right, today is a good day. Like, what's life-giving for you?
I think in my younger years, if you would have asked me, I would have said something that makes me feel better, something that builds me up, something that points me in the right direction. And I would say now something that is life-giving to me is just the ability to participate in bearing witness to the beauty of life, to really feel like I haven't harmed anyone. And if anything, I have helped them. And, there's somebody famous who said that, I'm sure, if you can't help people, at least don't harm them.
Yeah.
And I can't remember who said it, but when I read it, that really resonated with me, because we're all travelers through this moment in time. And again, it comes down to what lens we're looking at the world through. Are we looking at it through our hyper individualized lens, or are we looking at it through the collective consciousness? And I really see oneness as the all-encompassing reality in this existence, this life, if you will. And really studying non-duality has really transformed me and my heart and my mind and my perspective on the world. And one non-duality is basically the concept of oneness, that we are all, broken off from the same piece of source energy.
Yeah.
Something. So, a lot of people, if they have a religious sense, they would say like, we are all God's children.
Mm-hmm.
Same sort of thing, right? So if I hurt you, I hurt myself. You hurt you hurt me. We are all part of this kind of karmic balance where we're either giving or we're taking. And that karmic balance is always adjusting itself and always leveling itself. Yeah. And sometimes it's hard to believe that that's actually happening, because we see people who seemingly get away with doing terrible things to other people for, eons, and nothing ever checks them. But I always stop and say, well, even if something external isn't checking them, how are they internally?
Yeah.
Since really looking at other people as an extension of myself is really what, like I said, transformed everything that I do. Every decision I make, every action I take, it is all in relation to that understanding of universal oneness. And so I really try to enlist that, I think, whenever I speak to women particularly, and saying, again, this could be working for you. You're getting this money, you're doing these things, but how are you impacting other people? How is this actually impacting your soul by what you're doing? Like, there's the superficial wins, but then there's the true authentic outcomes. Yeah. So yeah, I think that just going back to that every time and leading with that, and that is really synonymous with love. It really is, because then if you see others as an extension of you, inadvertently you love them and you love yourself. And if not, if you don't love yourself, you obviously aren't loving other people. And that's where that cycle of harm happens. Yeah. Yeah.
You're so consistent with that message. You talk about bearing witness to beauty. Is there a moment recently for you that was that, or like, what was it? Tell us about something beautiful you witnessed recently.
It's funny. I find it now in everything, absolutely everything. Like, I find such sheer joy, and people think that this is actually an outcome of having been in prostitution. I don't know if it is, honestly. I think it's just awakening, spiritual awakening, and finally healing of my heart happening, where for so long it was just very hyper focused on myself and very aggressive, and who wronged me, who owes me, expectations, all these things. And once you just let that go and you live in the present moment, then you're not dwelling on the past and you're not worrying about the future. So I find absolute joy in anything I'm doing now. I could be folding laundry and I'm just like, life is great. I'm walking on a nature path. I hear the wind in the trees, the sun on my face. Life is so beautiful. And it really comes down, I think, also to how you want life to be and how you look at life, because you wake up every day with a choice of if you're going to be miserable or if you're going to just be carefree and, a traveler on the journey kind of thing. And
it's fascinating to hear you describe it that way. And I absolutely believe you when you're saying it. I think what even deepens my belief in you in saying it is knowing that you are not ignorant or avoidant when it comes to the trauma that you've been through in your life. So you've gotten to this point, and along that journey has been trauma and, all that. So I think that just reinforces it even more. And you're a wife, you're a mom, you're an activist, a scholar, a radical feminist, and a runner. You're still running, right?
I'm still running, not as much as I'd like to be. It's been a little bit icy here, so I've switched to doing yoga. And that was another thing too, was even the trauma, that was the last little bit that I had to let go. And of course, you can't ever fully rid yourself of trauma, but how you look at it can change. So for the longest time, when I would revisit the trauma, it would injure me and it would re-trigger me or re-traumatize me. And I would sometimes do a speech or a presentation somewhere, and I'd go home and I'd have to just kind of shut out the world for 2 or 3 days until it faded a little bit. Yeah. And now I pull from that trauma and I consider it a gift. I consider it a library of knowledge, of lived experience, where I can revisit that place without it having that impact on me anymore.
Yeah.
And I don't know exactly, like I said, I think it was studying non-duality, maybe becoming a mother softened me. I don't know what exactly changed that in me, but it changed my entire life. And, so I have a lot of people that say, like, how do you do this work? And I say, it's an honor to do the work. Yeah. Really, I look at it as a gift that some higher power said to me, you need to go through this to understand this, to then be on the journey with the knowledge from that library of trauma.
Yeah, I love that library. What do you call it? Library of knowledge, or library of trauma, library of knowledge. I haven't heard that connection. That's beautiful. Well, I want 2 more things from you, or want to invite you 2 more things. One is, can you talk for a little bit about the work you're doing currently and the things you think are really important for other people to hear about? Because I want them to hear directly from you. And then I have one last question.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for giving me space to plug my projects. I always appreciate it. I think anybody who has followed anything I've done has seen that there's really 2 things that I focus on the most with the work I do. One is changing social messaging around the concept of commercial sex, particularly debunking sex work ideology. And the second one is legislative responsives in regards to implementing Nordic model style legislation. So that has always been my focus. That continues to be my focus. And so I try to find little moments and pathways where I can do that. And there's some things I'm involved in right now that you and I spoke about and about, but I can't publicly talk about it just yet, mainly because of the backlash that you get when you're doing something bigger and it's going to be on a grander scale. You want to kind of keep it on the down low so that you're not getting a lot of attacks from, the money-making marketers of sex work ideology. So still just focusing a lot on PASEPA here and our challenges that are coming our way around our laws. We have a really strong push for full decriminalization here in Canada, which is very worrisome. We've had Nordic model legislation for 10 years, but it has not been endorsed or enforced very much at all. And now we have a very strong united push from the other side wanting full decrim. So that's mobilizing a lot of us to write letters to, the UN Special Rapporteur on violence against women and girls. She's put out a call for input on prostitution systems in the world, preparing a report before she leaves her position next year to give some recommendations about legislation globally. So I'm kind of working on a paper for her for that. Again, keeping an eye on some Canadian stuff, speaking with members of parliament, having some upcoming private meetings with some of them this year, 2024. And then on the social messaging side, myself and one of the mothers of one of Canada's missing and murdered Indigenous women, the mother, her name is Kathy King, and she has a website, missingcara.ca. Cara is C-A-R-A, so missingcara.ca. Phenomenal woman that I've been very close friends with for over a decade now. Her daughter was lost about 25 years ago and found a month later in a field just outside of Edmonton here. And she has just been a powerhouse for so many years. And so I approached her about 2 years ago when our Nordic model was really starting to be challenged again heavily. And I said, do you want to write a book, a Canadian book? Because we really don't have any text here in Canada that is a really powerful, strong compilation of voices and experiences and information and data to look at it through a Canadian lens. When I was in a lot of these hearings and stuff around PASEPA, they're talking about what's happening in New Zealand. They're talking about what's happening in Germany. And there's very little discussions about anything happening in Canada because we just have nothing to draw from. So Kathy King and I have spent probably, I want to say it's been about 2.5 years now, volunteering our time to write a book, which is, I think it's both almost just under 500 pages. And for anyone listening, Tom is very humble. He won't say, but he contributed a piece of writing to the book, and it's phenomenal. And so you're under our guest contributors. We're so grateful for that. So that book is actually coming out in January of 2024, and all of the profits from it are going to be going to in-demand projects and exit opportunity strategies for those in prostitution here in Canada. So we're really hoping to make it a top seller, to not only, educate the public, but also to have it adopted by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police for their training, municipal police forces, members of parliament, anyone that we can basically get it to who is in a position of change, correctional departments, for those who are working with women in prison. It's really a very multifaceted book, I guess you could say multi-usage book that will really fit a lot of places. So that's coming out soon. That's really been my big project. I'm still, working on the film. It seems like every time I mention this film, I'm like, it's coming. Yeah. But that's been a project that started in late 2019. That's a 8-episode docuseries called Labeled that I've been fortunate enough to do with Guerrilla Motion Pictures out of Edmonton here. And we're currently in the distribution stage. We just finished up the film festivals and got several awards, particularly for episode 5, which is our missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls episode. So that's really been internationally acclaimed and awarded, and we're quite happy with that. So now we're just trying to find the right distributor to, make it its home, and that way hopefully millions of people can see the journey through the 8 episodes and journey along that with all the people that have so graciously participated in that. And then finally, the last one, I keep on going here, is an international podcast that I'm fortunate to be a part of. There's myself and 8 others who 7 out of 9 of us are experiential from many areas of porn, prostitution, BDSM, trafficking, you name it. Like, we basically cover almost all the experiences. 2 of the women are Indigenous, all just brilliant women who are writers and really leading the way on change. So we're forming a podcast. And again, for the listeners, Tom is very humble, but Epic graciously gave a very large donation to that project that helped us get our mics and our headsets and our jingles set up and some other things. So, just so much appreciation for you and for the Epic team for how you guys always give back to the survivor community and support the work that experiential voices are coming out with. And you're always just platforming us. And we're so grateful that you're doing those things. So thank you.
That just feels so right. And so honestly, this might sound weird, but it feels very empowering to men. For men to be able to do that kind of stuff for leaders like you. So I'm really grateful. It feels very meaningful, and I'm excited. So my last question for you is, I just want you to have the last word. I'll say goodbye when we're done, but just leave us. What's your final word to people that are listening, men and women?
It's very cliche, but don't lose hope. It's so easy when you're inundated with such horrible examples of human interaction, and you just see exploitation and trauma and harm and destitution and marginalization. And, nothing in this topic is easy to handle. It's been 11 years now, and I still see things that rock me to my core. And I've developed, I think, a pretty thick skin, as I did when I was in prostitution, to not absorb those things in the moment. But really, self-care is so important. Like, it just takes, a lot to do this work. And I just want to say I'm so grateful to everybody who does do the work, because we're still on the side of the unpopular opinion. And because of that, we face a lot of abuse. And, I know that there's so many experiential people out there, and even our allies, who are just getting abused severely on social media by anonymous voices and people who are just so damaged and broken that they're lashing out on those who are trying to ignite change. And it's so easy to lose hope. So, like I said, it's so cliche, keep hope, in your heart, but
it's truth.
Yeah, you see these little wins, and even just a small win in this area means a life-changing shift for somebody. And I don't think that that's what people really grasp, is that you think that the change is small, but you have made such a huge impact on someone else's life based on just the nature of what area we're working in. So, don't lose hope. There's been so many times where I think I'm just going to quit. I'm just going to vanish and fall off the face of the earth and go open up like a sandwich shop or, something so basic. But then I just think it goes back to what we said, right? You have the choice. Are you going to act on it and maybe suffer a little bit, or are you going to go live your life and also suffer because you have that knowledge and you're just sitting there? So,
yeah. Wow. Andrea Heinz, you are a blessing, and I thank you.
Thank you. I thank you, Tom. I'm so glad that we're friends. I really am.
Likewise.
Thank you for listening to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast with your host, Tom Perez. This podcast is a production of Epic Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to disrupting the demand for commercial sexual exploitation and dismantling the forces that perpetuate it. I'm your producer, Lauren Trantham. Special shout out to our favorite logo designer, Michelle Boucher, as well as Wes Finley, who crafted and donated our amazing theme song. Interested in sponsoring an episode? Send us an email at podcast@epicproject.org. That's podcast@epikproject.org. As a nonprofit organization, your donations allow us not only to produce this podcast and change the conversation around sexual exploitation, but also to manage our many programs, such as buyer intervention, teen prevention, and community education. Your support also allows us to support survivors of exploitation and more. To learn more about our work and to donate, visit www.epicproject.org. Once again, that is www.epikproject.org. Most importantly, this podcast would be nothing without you, the listener. Thank you for tuning in, subscribing, and sharing this episode with your friends and loved ones. Thank you for your commitment to learning more about the issues that affect our most vulnerable populations. Thank you for navigating this masculine wilderness with us. See you next episode.